Hello, I'm Tom Harmon in Washington, D.C., and here's what's coming up tonight on The Big Picture. Last night's Republican debate was all about Trump, as the current Republican frontrunner spoke more than any other candidate and insulted his way into almost every answer. But did Trump do anything to make himself seem more like a serious candidate? We'll talk about that and more in tonight's Big Picture Politics panel. Also, the Straits of Mackinac is one of America's most important waterways. So why aren't officials taking more action to keep it safe from oil spills? And a new Wall Street Journal hit piece accuses Bernie Sanders of supporting policies that will bankrupt America. But are his proposals really all that expensive? We'll get to the bottom of that in tonight's Daily Take. This. We heard a lot of things at last night's Republican debate. We heard Jeb Bush talk about how he smoked pot as a teenager. We heard Carly Fiorina use her tremendous powers of imagination to describe a gruesome Planned Parenthood video that, well, doesn't exist. We also heard Chris Christie lie again about being appointed as a federal prosecutor the day before 9/11. It was actually several months later. And we even heard Donald Trump apologize, sort of, to Carly Fiorina for calling her ugly. But what we didn't hear from any of the candidates was any discussion about the real issues facing America right now. We didn't hear anything about our record levels of wealth and income inequality. We didn't hear anything about our failed trade policies and the Trans-Pacific Partnership that will sell the middle class further down the river. We didn't hear anything about the $1 trillion in student loan debt that's stunting economic growth and keeping young people from living out their dreams. And we didn't hear anything about police violence and our nation's ongoing struggle with racism and white supremacy. We also didn't hear much about something that affects the entire world, climate change. And when we did, the conversation was so through the Republican looking glass, it didn't even seem to matter what they were talking about. So to anyone who is really paying attention, last night's debate was gapingly absent of any talk about the big issues at stake in this election. Presidential candidate Bernie Sanders talked about this during an appearance on CNN earlier today. He said that watching the debate was so painful, he eventually had to turn it off.
It was really painful. I have to say this to you, Chris. I couldn't go on the full 3 hours. I gave up after 2.5. Look, their view, it goes without saying that my views are different than theirs, but what was really remarkable is the degree to which they avoided the major issues facing the American people and believe that every single problem facing humanity is all attributed to Barack Obama. He has caused all of the problems. In terms of climate change, no, Chris, I did not hear anybody say, oh, this is a planetary crisis. We have got to do something. Really, the federal government should not do something? No scientist that I know believes that. What they think is if we don't act now, the bad situation will become much worse in later years. In terms of childhood poverty, I didn't hear a word about the need to address the fact that 40% of African-American kids in this country are living in poverty, nor did I hear a word, by the way, about racial justice in this country.
Bernie is, of course, right, but do any of the Republican candidates even care? Or are they too busy trying to impress the Republican donor class, the billionaires, to worry about issues that affect real Americans? Joining me for tonight's special post-debate edition of the Politics Panel are Brian Darling, Senior Vice President of Third Dimension Strategies, and Ari Rabenhoft, host of The Agenda on SiriusXM Progress. And Neil McCabe, hopefully, will be joining us shortly. Thanks, guys, for showing up tonight.
Thank you.
So isn't the reason we didn't hear anything of real importance last night, or at least I'm sure you'll dispute this, Brian, but and you're welcome to. But isn't it really that, with the exception of Donald Trump, pretty much everybody on that stage was making a sales pitch to a billionaire who might fund their campaigns, as opposed to a sales pitch to a voter who will pull a lever for them?
Well, first of all, I think we can all agree that this debate was much better than the Democratic debate. That hasn't happened, because I think that's one thing that's interesting about this is that, you know, the Republicans, I guess they get to have a free shot at Hillary Clinton and beat up on her, and the Democrats don't have a way to respond because they haven't had debates. I think that's a problem. But
I agree, but you're not answering my
I
question.
think it's a problem for Democrats, by the way.
I agree. And I think it's a problem for Hillary Clinton. I think this effort by Debbie Wasserman Schultz and the DNC to protect Hillary by minimizing the debates is actually hurting her. But that's.
But I guess to your point, one of the criticisms really falls squarely on the shoulders of CNN for the way they conducted the debate. I mean, if you don't like the issues that came up, why didn't they ask the questions? There weren't questions that were probing on those issues.
That's the ultimate question.
But I want to agree with that. And this is my analysis. And I was really thinking about this today because last night I was in like the thick of it. I was tweeting, then I went to sleep, and I have to wake up for the 6 a.m. show. So, late night, woke up, and then I was thinking about this during the day, and what I realized is Jake Tapper was treating those candidates on stage not as people who might become the next president of the United States, but as pundits on CNN, right? All the questions were, so Tom, I hear this guy over here said something nasty about you. What do you want to say? Wait, you've been invoked. You go. I mean, it was as if they were on crossfire, not people who should be asked questions, because one of those people will face a Democratic candidate, and one of those people on that stage has a significant potential of becoming president of the United States, right? And therefore will have a tremendous amount of policy, but instead it was, hey, you two, fight.
Yeah. Well, I think to what Brian just said, and by the way, Neil McCabe just joined us. Neil, a political reporter.
I was just in that B-roll.
Yeah.
I was at that rally.
There you go. Okay, political reporter with One America News Network, and glad to have you with us. It hit me this afternoon. In fact, it was kind of halfway through my radio show. I started, thinking about this and talking about this. Something that Brian just mentioned, which is that there are all these issues. And I started the show, complaining about the fact that none of these issues got brought up. We have the highest rate of childhood poverty in the developed world. We have, as a fully developed country, one of the worst situations with regard to corporations not paying taxes and just basically screwing the country. We've got our school systems falling apart. There are real issues here, and none of those issues were brought up. But then it occurred to me what Brian said. Take it up with Jake Tapper and Dana Bash. And I know you would expect that what's his name from Salem Radio is not going to ask a question that would be Hugh Hewitt would not ask a question.
See what happened to him the last time he tried to get tough with somebody.
That would be uncomfortable for a Republican. But shouldn't the Republican field have to answer? What are you going to do about it? $1.4 trillion in student loan debt.
Or how about like you were saying
why
before,
is CNN basically only asking Republican questions of Republicans?
Well, I think that was, well, first of all, I agree with you about the punditry. To me, it was almost like a game show.
Yep.
When you ask somebody, who should be on the $20 bill, like, really? Like, that was...
Yeah.
But I think that one of the things that the RNC, the Republican National Committee, was concerned about is that in the last cycle, you had so many of the moderators who were asking questions of Republican candidates that Republican candidates don't even deal with and weren't even interesting to Republican voters. And so there was an idea that if you're going to have a Republican primary, it should be about Republican issues and things that Republicans...
Right, but Republicans have experienced poverty in the United States. Republicans have children
I think they can speak to it.
Can't
Certainly,
get health care.
And there was one substantive exchange really last night. There were two really substantive points made during the debate and one substantive exchange. The substantive exchange was between Rand Paul and Chris Christie on the war on drugs. That was the one place where we actually had a substantive conversation about a real policy difference between two candidates.
Right.
And
but we also did in the Iraq War. I think
that was my second.
You had two very good discussions on those two issues, and it shows that there is a difference in the Republican Party on the issue of the war on drugs and criminal justice reform, and on the issue of war and what kind of a party the Republican Party is going to be. I mean, Rand Paul made the point that there's no real difference between Hillary Clinton's foreign policy and what would be Jeb Bush's foreign policy, because the parties, they aren't that much different when it comes to foreign policy. They both like to fight wars just in different places.
It seems, unfortunately. In 2015 alone, 829 people have been killed by police, a disproportionate number of whom are black. No discussion of that. And yet, actually, on the other side, over at Fox News, they have invented this war against police. When this year fewer police officers have died, 25 for the whole year, the whole nation. I mean, you're more likely to die if you're a construction worker than if you're a cop. It's not even in the top 10 most dangerous professions.
Well, I disagree with that in a sense.
And there was no discussion of any of that.
But you do have situations like in Baltimore where it seems like the police are afraid to go out on the streets because they are worried about retribution, and the result is just a massive crime wave where you have a lawless city in Baltimore where they have record numbers of murders. And I think
that has nothing to do with policing. That has to do with the fact that all those jobs that used to be in Baltimore are now in South Vietnam or in Vietnam.
I think the policing is a small part of it. You can't say it's not a part of it at all. I mean, it's
there is
massive
no
spike
evidence,
in 1 year.
No, this is an absolute BS, made up Fox so-called news story. There is no evidence that police are not doing the jobs that they used to be doing.
Well, then
you look at the number of arrests, you look at the number of actions, you look at the number of cops, and any metric you want to use. There is no evidence from any city anywhere in the United States that police are dialing back. What's going on is, the economy is continuing to suck.
In 1 year? I mean, they've had record numbers of murders in that city.
But let's be clear what record is. Record is the crime went like that. Like it was here, it went to here, it went to here, and then it went to here. It's not. We're still better, a lot better than here.
Dead cat bounce of the murder rate.
I'm saying that you can't quite say it's a huge. Like this is not a statistical trend. If we see this, it's a problem.
But you're saying it would really shock you in the mood that we have right now. It would shock you if you learned that police were pulling back.
When Nate wrote this script 4 hours ago, did the initial research for this, there was 829 people who've been killed this year by police.
Well,
it is now 834.
Well, I don't really want to talk about...
5 people have been killed by police in the 4 hours in the United States in the 4 hours since Nate did the research. One of our producers, Nate Sweet.
Right. Yeah, but we don't know what was going on there. Okay, so it's like cops don't.
I'm telling you,
cops aren't going out trying to kill people, let alone.
I disagree.
Like nobody wants. It's a career ender.
You have a situation where politicians are putting the police in a very difficult situation. Many of these situations are because of politicians, not because we have bad police.
We're going to have to get back to this in just a moment. More of tonight's Politics Panel right after the break.
RT America viewers are smarter. They're critical thinkers. They're looking for more. They want a perspective that they don't usually see.
There are people that are looking for the big picture.
People who are done with the exploitation of all of our resources.
They are young, they're independent-minded, they are free spirits, they are people who want the truth as opposed to what is spoon-fed by corporate media.
They question the status quo, and I think they're a little more tech-savvy than the average news consumer.
We don't have to answer to anyone except the people that we're going to report on. Because of that, we're news for the people.
They're viewers who are looking for stories that are different, stories about people who need a voice, and RT gives them that voice.
Someone who questions and asks more.
I'm Wolf Blitzer, you're in the situation. Not now for the ridiculous.
Elect Republicans and they will burn the place down.
This is my problem with liberals.
I'm the resident. Let's talk about that.
And welcome back to tonight's Big Picture Politics panel. Still with me, Brian Darling, Ari Rabenhoft, and Neil McCabe. And although he's still technically the front runner, Donald Trump struggled during last night's debate to come off as a serious candidate. The bluster and insults were all there, but he didn't do a particularly good job channeling that bravado into anything that resembled a serious policy proposal. One low point came when he was challenged once again on his lack of knowledge about foreign policy. Marco Rubio accused him of not knowing about the important issues facing America. And Trump responded by saying that he will know once he gets elected. Check it out.
You have to understand, I am not sitting in the United States Senate with, by the way, the worst voting record there is today. Number one. I am not sitting in the United States Senate. I'm a businessman doing business transactions. Okay. I am doing business transactions. I will know more about this, and as you said, that was very acceptable. And when you listen to that whole interview, it was a great interview. You said it, I didn't.
Yeah.
Well, now I did. But I will listen. Just 1 second.
But he addressed
just 1 second.
I never get addressed. So when I do, I'm going to jump in.
I will know more about the problems of this world by the time I sit. And you look at what's going on in this world right now by people that supposedly know this world is a mess.
All right. So it's my takeaway from last night was that this is the end of Donald Trump.
You laugh, yet I bet you agree with Donald Trump more than you agree with Marco Rubio on foreign policy.
I actually, and on economic policy, I mean, I think that Donald Trump makes more sense than any of the other Republicans, but I think that this is also the end of his candidacy.
Also,
but you know, and I've not been with the herd who, you know, when he insulted John McCain, said, "Oh, he's going down in flames," and blah, blah. You know, I all along I've been saying, you know,
because he hasn't put the work in. He obviously hasn't put the work in.
That's right. Yeah, he's a prima donna. He wants to show up and just be naturally brilliant, and you know, yeah.
And whereas Marco Rubio has obviously put the work in.
Yeah.
I mean, he's
done his homework.
He was strong. He was elegant. His rhetoric is beautiful. I mean, it was just.
How's he polling?
I was just going. Well, my punchline was going to be like, it's too bad he looks like he's 12 years old, because he just doesn't have the gravitas.
Well, I think he's running for vice president.
Well, that may very well be true, but I think that he's certainly he certainly knew what he was talking about at every juncture and wasn't flustered.
He knew what he was saying, and he was wrong about a lot. Look, Donald Trump, I'd like his campaign to be over, because then maybe we don't have to go through this reality TV show. Are the people who don't support him, is it new knowledge that he doesn't know stuff about foreign policy today?
I think his support is broad but not deep. I think it's broad but shallow. And I think the exact opposite of that is Bernie Sanders, whose support is very, very, it's broadening, but it's very, very deep.
It's a little bit of snobbery to make too much fun of Donald Trump, because although you don't like the way he expresses himself, he was right in so many points. I mean, he was right when he said that the George W. Bush administration gave us Barack Obama. I mean, Republicans hear that and they say yes. The end of the Bush presidency was not an auspicious end, and he was so unpopular that Barack Obama did win.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, W gave up the fight.
And he was right when he said that we should put a 35% tariff on imports into the United States if we want to bring our factories back home. And he was right when he said hedge fund billionaires should be paying taxes like the rest of us.
What he's wrong about is he's right, and then he says things like, what I'm going to do is make Mexico pay, and how am I going to do that? Well, I'm basically going to ignore the fact that the WTO and NAFTA exist. And while you and I would love for the government to tear up NAFTA and the WTO, it just doesn't quite work. The problem is it doesn't quite work like that.
Right?
I don't think so.
I don't think it works that way.
No, they can do anything.
Moving along, the mainstream media has anointed former Hewlett-Packard CEO Carly Fiorina the winner of last night's debate, in part because of her tough talk on foreign policy. The only problem? She's a hypocrite when it comes to Iran. She blasted the Iranian nuclear deal because it lifts sanctions. But when she was CEO of Hewlett-Packard in the 1990s, her company got around export bans to sell computers to Iran. As Bloomberg reported earlier this week, while Fiorina was in charge, Hewlett-Packard used a European subsidiary and a Middle Eastern distributor to sell hundreds of millions of dollars of printers and other computer equipment to Iran. If HP executives knew about what the Middle Eastern distributor was doing, they would have been breaking U.S. law. So, when I first read that, I thought, she's the perfect vice presidential candidate, because this is exactly what Dick Cheney and Halliburton were doing in 1999. He was illegally selling stuff to Iran that could be used for oil field drilling in violation of federal law, And Cheney could have gone to prison for it.
You know what my line was that really angered some Republicans on my radio show a few days ago? This Iran deal will sell weapons. Barack Obama is now America's greatest, Iran's greatest arms dealer. You know who was Iran's greatest arms dealer in America? Ronald Reagan.
For 6 years.
Was Iran's greatest arms dealer.
6 years.
Like, I guess it's appropriate at the Ronald Reagan Library then.
But were there circumstances?
Yeah, it was a deal to hold the hostages so that Reagan could get elected.
But I think there's a strong case to be made that many of the Republicans on stage, Rand Paul, for example, says he's for negotiations, he's for diplomacy with Iran, but he's against this deal because it's a bad deal. First of all, I think if you're going to have buy-in, you're going to have a agreement that works for a long period of time. It should have been a treaty. It should have been presented to the Senate. And once you have the Senate buy in an agreement like this, then it will last.
But it's not bilateral.
Well, guess what? It's going to end if we get a Republican president because of the way Barack Obama.
It's not
bilateral.
Yes, it will.
I'm willing to make a Mitt Romney unit bet that it doesn't end.
Really? So you think if Jeb Bush is president, that he will honor the agreement and move forward?
I think there's no way not to honor the agreement in that it's not just us. You have Russia and China who are the ones who basically hold the keys there. And do you think Jeb is going to be able to tell Russia and China to be like, we're not honoring the agreement? Are you going to honor the agreement? No.
But it also puts us in a situation where if the agreement's broken, one of the remedies that our leaders might resort to is bombing Iran.
Well, that's one of the remedies that we have available to us right this very second. And in fact, I would submit to you that if it wasn't for the rational and steady hand of Barack Obama, Bibi Netanyahu already would have done that, and we'd be in a god-awful war in the Middle East. But who knows? I don't know. Speaking of keeping us safe, last night's debate was supposed to be Jeb Bush's chance to show America his high-energy side. Instead, it became a forum for him to show off a remarkably revisionist sense of history. Check this out.
Your brother and your brother's administration gave us Barack Obama because it was such a disaster those last 3 months that Abraham Lincoln couldn't have been elected.
You know what? As it relates to my brother, there's one thing I know for sure. He kept us safe.
Right, but how safe did George W. Bush and his administration really keep us? Let's ask Condoleezza Rice.
Isn't it a fact, Dr. Rice, that the August 6 PDB warned against possible attacks in this country? And I ask you whether you recall the title of that PDB.
I believe the title was Bin Laden determined to attack inside the United States.
All right. George W. Bush oversaw the biggest intelligence failure in American history. 9/11 happened on his watch. He did not keep 4,000 people safe in New York City. How can Jeb even say such a thing? How can Republicans promulgate this mythology after George Bush totally dropped the ball on this?
But the bigger question is, so
even according to the Republicans on the 9/11 Commission, George Bush dropped the ball.
The Bush administration started a program of spying on American citizens that Barack Obama continued. Both parties have been bad on a lot of these issues, these civil liberties issues that are important to the American people. We had a Bush administration.
You're changing
it's a very specific
I'm
answer.
asking about keeping us safe.
Right.
I'm pointing out
there's
that
no way
Jeb
you can
Bush
blame George Bush for the attacks of 9/11.
Oh, I just
you
did.
You can't.
I agree with the 9/11 Commission report and the Republicans on the 9/11 Commission who said that
20 hijackers in this country. It's like a needle in a haystack.
No, it wasn't a needle in a haystack. The CIA had the information,
right.
The FBI had the information, and if George W. Bush, instead of taking the longest vacation in presidential history, and during that vacation when he was notified that bin Laden was going to attack the United States, refused to go back to Washington, D.C., stayed for another 2 weeks in Texas, finally got so embarrassing he went to Florida where his brother was a governor, and he could hide out. They locked down the state.
Are you telling me that they had bin Laden in their sights and they said, Mr. President, should we fire the missile?
If George W. Bush
or was that Clinton?
Had gone back to Washington, D.C. and said, I want the head of the FBI, I want the head of the CIA, I want to know what the hell is going on here. We've got this PDB, we've got Russia, we've got Israel, we've got England, we've got Germany, all telling us that this strike is going to happen, and it's going to happen this fall. And I don't think that George Bush knew what was going to happen or where it was going to happen. I think that's why he stayed in Florida.
No.
But he knew something was.
There's no way that's true. That's conspiracy theory crazy talk.
Let's talk about what happened.
It really is.
Let's talk about what happened after. We took our eye off the ball in Afghanistan. We let bin Laden escape at Tora Bora. We moved into Iraq. We destabilized the entire Middle East. We empowered Iran by destabilizing Iraq because without that balance, Iran became a greater power in the region.
And then Barack Obama went and stood on George Bush's shoulders and destabilized Libya, destabilized Egypt. Syria's a mess.
I don't see Barack Obama running for president anymore.
No, but these are policies that we're going to see if Hillary
Barack
Clinton.
Obama responsible.
State is running.
You're saying that Obama is responsible for the drought across the Middle East that led to the uprisings
We
in
attacked
Tunisia
Libya and toppled that government.
You think that what happened in Libya was because of a drought?
I think that what began the so-called Arab Spring was, yes, a drought. And
so
it's ongoing
whatever
right
we
now.
blame on Barack Obama is
what
weather.
you're seeing in California right now, you're also seeing in the Middle East. And it's a horrible thing. You had 1.5 million farmers
spring?
just in Syria. 5 years ago, just in Syria, you had 1.5 million farmers had to leave their land because it was turning to desert. They moved into the cities, and Bashar al-Assad.
Tom's not the person saying this. The CIA is saying this too.
Well, whoever's saying it is wrong.
Is the CIA right
I'm
now?
glad you're smarter than the CIA.
Our guys
Wow.
fearmonger.
This guy
I think
got a
many
genius
conservatives fearmonger using ISIS to scare the American people to vote for Republicans. I think the left uses climate change to scare, as if somehow the U.S. government's going to pass a law or sign a treaty and it's going to magically solve this climate change problem.
It's not magic, it's science.
No, it's so you're scientifically going to tell me how is the government going to do it? How is the government going to do it? Why don't we just get off fossil fuels and take our cars and put them away?
Sulfur dioxide
Turn off
problem.
the lights in the
How
studio.
did the government solve the ozone hole?
It's actually, there's a very easy answer. Last week I was in Germany. I took a train across, 4-hour train ride across the middle of Germany, and what did I see? Mile after mile after mile of houses covered with solar panels. Oh, yeah, I would love to have that stagnant.
That's crony capitalism. Those are heavily
giant
subsidized.
windmills.
Yeah,
more than 50%.
More subsidized in the oil industry that gets, or more subsidized in the coal industry that doesn't play any of its intrinsic costs.
Before we go
down that,
we don't want to go at me on subsidies for fossil fuels because I will wipe the floor with this.
I don't want to talk about that. Let's just talk about solar. You told me the reason why all these panels are there is because the German taxpayers are being jammed by the crony capitalism in Germany.
Actually, Neil, you're wrong.
Being jammed.
You don't think there's subsidies in Germany for solar panels?
No, I know exactly how it worked. I knew the guy who put the thing together, and no, there aren't subsidies. Basically, you get a 10-year mortgage. You have to be a homeowner. You get a 10-year mortgage from the bank, and you pay it off, and you've got a 50-year solar panel. But we're out of time anyhow. I encourage you to look up the program. The Germans really, and they're getting over 50% of their electricity this summer from anyhow. Brian, Ari, Neil, it's great to see you guys. Thank you very much. Well, thank you.
I'm Jesse Ventura, and I bring you the truth, loud and clear. I was a Navy frogman, a professional wrestler, and the governor of Minnesota. Now I'm taking you off the grid. Join me every Friday for Off the Grid on RT. Question more and stay vigilant.
I'm Tom Hartman, and you're watching RT America. The United States is now officially an oligarchy. What happens if this guy becomes president? He has completely succeeded in falling down Alice's rabbit hole and flipping reality upside down. Question more.
I want you to look at what is going on in downtown America.
Many couldn't help but think that it was a military force, not a police force.
Tanks, combat gear, assault rifles.
Today's breed of American law enforcement is dressed in riot gear.
Is the U.S. now in a war against its own people?
We're being militarized.
Police forces are arming their law enforcement agents with weapons of war.
What politicians do is something we don't do. They put themselves on the line, and they get accepted or rejected. So when you want to be president, why would you want to be? Why would someone want to be president? What's it like to be president? What's it like when the phone rings at 3 in the morning? Can't be a good call. I'm interested always in the whys and the hows. And Q Larry. Question more.
Tonight's Green Report, we go to the Great Lakes, in between Lake Huron and Lake Michigan and the Straits of Mackinac. Those straits also separate the lower and upper peninsulas of Michigan. But it's also the site of two aging oil pipelines operated by the Canadian oil company Enbridge, and they were built over half a century ago. Those pipelines were only supposed to last half a century. In 2013, 60 years after the pipelines were built, 10 years after the pipelines were originally supposed to be decommissioned, environmental advocates with the National Wildlife Federation dove into the Straits of Mackinac to investigate the state of the pipelines. According to a team, they found broken structural braces and sections of completely unsupported pipeline. And investigative reporter Spencer Chumbley with Vice's Motherboard found that if just one of the pipelines ruptured, it would spill 1.5 million gallons of oil even with an immediate response, and it would rapidly spread throughout the Great Lakes. Take a look.
This is what an oil spill would look like in the Straits of Mackinac. The colored dots show where the oil would travel within the lake's water tables. Red is near surface, yellow mid-depth, blue near bottom. The oil would travel far, fast, and in different directions.
Already, after 6 days, these surface particles are down, heading into Rogers City, 40 miles away from the Straits.
Though Enbridge denies these claims, the company does have a rather checkered history, with more than 800 spills just between 1999 and 2010 for a total of 6.8 million gallons of spilled oil, including the largest inland oil spill in our nation's history. Here now to discuss the Mackinac pipelines and the potential disaster lurking under the Great Lakes is Spencer Chumbley, investigative journalist and filmmaker. Welcome, Spencer.
Thank you.
Great to have you with us. What brought this to your attention?
I'm from the Midwest. I remember actually swimming in the Straits of Mackinac as a kid, and so after coming off a story about oil by rail, I wanted to look into the Great Lakes and see if there was anything similar like this, oil being transported on Lake Superior or any other lakes in that system.
Is this company the company that owns the pipeline that spilled in the Kalamazoo River?
Yes, so Enbridge no one knew who Enbridge was before 2010. And so after the spill in the Kalamazoo River in 2010, where they leaked a very large portion of oil from the Alberta tar sands, which sinks and actually is very hard to clean up, I think it was kind of a little bit of a wake-up call to activists and environmental groups in Michigan. And so after that occurred, groups like the National Wildlife Federation kept looking further, and they actually had never really heard of the pipeline beneath the Straits. So that incident, which was the largest inland oil spill in American history, really prompted residents of Michigan to look further and to see what other pipelines they had operating. And they were very surprised to find that there's a 62-year-old pipeline under the Straits of Mackinac, run by the same company who had just dumped all this oil into the Kalamazoo River.
Is that, and in fact, they're still trying to clean up the Kalamazoo River, aren't they?
I mean, they say it's since been cleaned just this past fall that they completed cleanup. I mean, you're talking about a $1.2 billion cleanup effort, which is actually quite a bit of money. In terms of kind of the insurance that the state of Michigan just recently asked Enbridge to have, it's actually quite a drop in the bucket of what they're willing to pay or what they're able to pay to do a cleanup. So
now that spill in the Kalamazoo River was in a pipeline that was carrying tar sands oil, which, as you point out, sinks rather than floats, so it's really, really hard to clean. And it heads right down into the water table below that if given an opportunity. What kind of petroleum is flowing through these pipelines up in the Mackinac Straits, the Straits of Mackinac?
I mean, up until recently, people didn't actually know, and that's really been the kind of the basis of the fight and the argument for some of the activists based in Michigan and the Great Lakes area is the idea that they don't know what's happening. They don't know how the pipeline's supported, they don't know what's traveling through it, and they don't know what kind of preventative measures that Enbridge is actually taking to preserve or repair the pipeline. Enbridge has said that there is not any heavy oil or tar sands crude, as we understand it, to be flowing through those pipelines. And the state of Michigan recently, just in their report that they released in July, asked that they should be a ban on that type of oil traveling through the Straits due to the precarious situation, the depth of the pipelines.
Is this oil coming from Canada to be used in the United States? I mean, where are these pipelines going from and to?
So Line 5 is the one that runs through the Straits. It's one of a large network of pipelines called the Lakehead System, which travels through Canada, from Canada down into South Dakota, into Minnesota, and then kind of hits Superior, Wisconsin, where it breaks off into several different lines. Some of these are now traveling traveling through Wisconsin down eventually to the Gulf of Mexico for export.
Wow.
So realistically, it's people have been calling not necessarily Line 5, but the Enbridge system, generally in the Midwest area, kind of the Keystone XL that no one knows about.
Right.
While people have been focused on Keystone XL and Obama's approval or disapproval of that, Enbridge has kind of been quietly upgrading in its pipeline capacity in a very, very small capacity. But when you add all those little pieces up, you've got a line like Line 61 traveling through Wisconsin that's pumping 3 times what the Keystone XL was going to carry.
Wow. In the event of a spill, is there a liability cap, or how does Enbridge? What are they going to do?
I mean, the idea, and there's been certain fights, especially in Madison, Wisconsin, they were kind of the last line before this Line 61 was going to expand to carry this much tar sands oil through the state. But if you look at the expenses that Enbridge has incurred from the Kalamazoo spill, a $1.2 billion cleanup, and that's not including fees or penalties that the federal government has levied against them. They're looking at a $900 million possible maximum cost for a spill in the Straits. Right. I mean, I guess what really comes down to is it's $900 million, but what does that actually cost? They can obviously absorb it, they can pay for that, right. But what is the loss to the Great Lakes ecosystem and the people who are relying on that, including drinking water from 2 countries?
It would be insane. It would be incredibly dramatic. Spencer, thanks so much for the great investigative reporting you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming on our program. In other environmental news, the fight over hydraulic fracturing, more commonly called fracking, mostly centers around how the process ruins groundwater, or the increasingly certain science that shows that fracking causes earthquakes. Less frequently covered is the harm that's done to communities. And what's almost never mentioned are the harms and risks that workers within the industry face. Even though that industry holds up job creation as one of the major selling points for bringing fracking into an area, a new film from Josh Fox called Gaswork, The Fight for CJ's Law, explores the reality behind fracking jobs. The film looks at how dangerous the jobs in the fracking industry actually are, the fact that the fatality rate of oil fields jobs is 7 times greater than the national average, and the fact that workers are exposed to chemicals which have unknown long-term effects. They interview workers who have cleaned drill sites, moved the radioactive and carcinogenic materials that are involved in fracking, and cleaned the tanks that contained volatile organic compounds without safety equipment. Here now to discuss the risks surrounding natural gas fracking jobs and what's being done to make that industry safer and more accountable for its workers' well-being is Tyson Slocum, Director of Public Citizens Energy Program. Welcome back, Tyson.
Always great to be here, Tom.
It's always great to have you. So what kinds of dangers are these workers actually being exposed to? And is this about chemical exposure or general dangers in the workplace, things falling on you and whatever?
It's a combination of both chemical exposure and the hazards of dealing with a heavy industry type of operation like fracking and oil drilling is. You have to remember that oil drilling, and particularly fracking, is a very industrial activity, and unlike other industrial sectors of the economy, oil and natural gas drilling and fracking features very low rates of unionization of workers. And so you've got fewer workplace protections on a lot of these sites, combined with the fact that states play a leading role in oversight, and some of the states where the fracking is going on are choosing not to prioritize worker protections. And so what we've seen from this investigation are examples of inadequate training and exposure to some of these toxic chemicals and other hazards. And the concern I have, Tom, is that we're in a low price situation with both natural gas and oil fracking. And that means that the companies are tightening their belts and figuring out how to cut costs. And a lot of times they're going to cut programs associated with worker health and safety in order to make sure that they meet their profit targets. And so I see us as entering an even riskier time period for the oil and gas industry, but particularly for the fracking industry.
And in the absence of a union, the workers really only have the government to turn to in terms of keeping their workplace safe.
Right.
Unless I'm missing something here.
Right. And so there is a federal agency, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, but they've got a spotty track record in terms of doing actual site visits They're very reliant upon the companies to essentially self-police a lot of these work sites.
Well, they've been largely defunded in big ways since the 1980s, too, have they not?
Correct. And you know, for a lot of these workers, they're desperate. They often are in areas with very high rates of unemployment. A lot of these rural areas where fracking is going on in Pennsylvania and in North Dakota and Texas typically occur in traditionally high unemployment rural areas. And so these workers, they want to earn some money, and they're going to feel some pressure when their bosses start to tell them to cut corners when it comes to safety.
What is CJ's Law?
CJ's Law? I'm actually not familiar with CJ's Law.
It was mentioned in Josh's movie on that. So one of the ways that these companies have been avoiding even discussing or dealing with the toxic chemicals that they're exposing their workers to is by claiming that it's proprietary information. It's a secret sauce, right, for fracking. How's that holding up?
Pennsylvania a couple of years ago, passed this very controversial fracking law that initially even restricted a doctor's access to the chemical information about these chemical compounds that are used in the fracking process in case a worker or some citizen came in that was exposed to something near a fracking site. The doctor wanted to share information about possible exposure to some toxins. The law, as it was originally written, severely limited the ability of that doctor to obtain that information and share it with others. The state has since rolled back that to a certain degree, but what we still see is this ludicrous argument that the oil industry is entitled to some form of proprietary treatment where they don't have to disclose details about the chemicals that they're exposing to workers and that they're injecting into the ground and communities.
I've been suggesting for years that the reason for that is because they've figured out a way to dispose of toxic waste without having to pay for it, and that they're using lubricants that are just toxic chemicals. Am I a total conspiracy nut here?
No, I mean, it's their cost for disposing these chemicals is actually very cheap because all they do is they ship it out to some disposal well where they're injecting it, and there isn't a whole lot of federal or even state regulation.
They used to have to dispose of them, by burning them and just completely destroying them.
Right, and now they
just stick in the ground.
Now they're just sticking in the ground, which is causing earthquakes because they don't have to do seismic surveys beforehand.
Amazing. Tyson Slocum, great to have you with us.
Always my pleasure, Tom.
Thank you. Coming up, the Wall Street Journal took a serious look at Bernie Sanders' policy proposals, but it might not have been a completely honest look. More on that in tonight's Daily Take.
The government thought their proposal for a merger was going to be a boom, but alas, it turned out to be a bust.
We're in exactly the same crisis, only the situation is more dire now than it has ever been.
The question then becomes, what happens when you have an economic downturn?
China has pledged to contribute a total of $41 billion to the bank.
Beijing has to keep it going.
Some fundraisers are predicting the next election could cost $5 billion.
People have got to know whether or not their president's a crook.
The American people deserve to know
what
answers.
What difference at this point does it make?
We must guard against the military-industrial complex.
The Cold War is over.
We shall never negotiate.
An American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima.
To know war is to know that there is still madness. Yet, we do what we must.
The only thing we have to fear is...
I am officially running.
The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted.
Here's what people have been saying about Redacted tonight.
Give it to us.
Redacted is full-on awesome.
So
the only show I go out of my way to watch every week. It really packs a punch. Lee Camp is the John Oliver of RT America.
You do have the same accent.
Hey, we are apparently better than boobs.
Nothing's better than boobs.
You see, people you've never heard of love Redacted tonight. The president of the World Bank, though, hates it.
Yeah, he doesn't really have any taste.
Seriously, he sent us an email.
to the rest of the news. Earlier this month, a French appeals court upheld a 2012 ruling that found Monsanto guilty of poisoning a farmer who inhaled one of that company's products. The herbicide, called Lasso, has been used since the 1960s, but was prohibited in Canada, Belgium, and Britain, and was eventually banned in France in 2007. In 2012, a French court had previously found Monsanto responsible for poisoning the farmer, Paul Francois. Francois was a grain grower who had been exposed to the chemical on his farm in 2004, before that chemical was banned in France. After he was exposed to the chemical, Francois suffered from neurological problems, headaches, and memory loss. The ruling earlier this month affirmed the ruling that found Monsanto guilty for not providing adequate warning labels for Lasso. And earlier this year, France ceased over-the-counter sales of Roundup, another Monsanto herbicide, after the World Health Organization declared glyphosate, the main ingredient, to be probably carcinogenic. Nonetheless, Monsanto has declared that it will appeal the ruling from earlier this month to France's highest appeals court, and they continue to provide Roundup to U.S. farmers to spray on a broad swath of our food crops. Here now to discuss this case and what this could mean for Monsanto's liability in the future is Patty Levera, Assistant Director of Food and Water Watch. Hey, Patty, welcome back.
Thanks.
It's always great to have you with us. First of all, Lasso. Why was Lasso banned?
So all these herbicide formulations always have a bunch of different things, but the main ingredient was a pesticide called Alachlor, and it's been linked to lots of things over the years, ranging from neurological problems, which is what this case was about, to some classifications that said in high doses it's a likely carcinogen. So I think the evidence just finally started to build up, and many countries said enough is enough, we're not going to allow this one to be used anymore.
And what's the status of Lasso here?
So I checked on this today. My understanding is Monsanto's not marketing it, but our EPA didn't stop them from doing so. Monsanto made a decision to pull it back.
Are farmers buying it under a different name? Is it coming in through Mexico, or is it simply not pretty much being used?
It's not in that formulation. That's always the $1 million question, and I actually don't know. So that's always a question. When it's still allowed to be registered, could it come back?
Right. Or is it around in some way that we just don't realize that's
in different formulation?
That's what it is. Yeah. Is this French ruling the precautionary principle? I thought was kind of ruled in Europe, that you have to prove something's safe before you hit people with it. But if this French farmer, Paul Francois, was exposed to this and damaged by it back in 2007, what happened to the precautionary principle?
So the precautionary principle should be the operating principle for how things get on the market in the first place. Right. And so the EU has embraced that. The US has not touched that in terms of our regulatory arena. And it's supposed to say you have to prove that it's safe before we let you sell it. And they have a phrase, no data, no market. You can't provide data showing it's safe. You don't get to market that chemical. So that's a newer concept. I think it's newer than Lasso's kind of an older formulations. I think Lasso predated that approach.
So
but this lawsuit was actually just about straight up liability. I used this product. I had these effects. Your product caused it. And the court backed that farmer up.
Does that have any consequences for the United States? Is this setting any kind of precedent? Or are we going to have to wait until it goes to the French equivalent of the Supreme Court?
So it's going to have to do that for this farmer to see some relief. It's going to have to go, assuming that they appeal, which I think Monsanto's probably going to appeal. Unfortunately, that doesn't feed into our court system. So somebody would have to make the same kind of case here and provide evidence that my use of this product had this acute effect on me. And a judge would have to go for that.
Now, moving from Lasso to Roundup. Roundup is made up of a chemical that I'm probably mangling the name of. I thought it was glyphosate.
Glyphosate, yeah, close enough.
Yeah, okay. And California is going to start labeling glyphosate as possibly carcinogenic. Do I have that right?
So the World Health Organization has an arm that looks at cancer research, and they looked at glyphosate and declared it a probable human carcinogen. And because California has a system that includes that, and Prop 65, people have heard of this. You see warnings. This contains a product that may be a carcinogen.
Which includes alcohol in bars and restaurants.
Right. You see the signs all over the place in California. But that designation, which didn't come from our U.S. government, it came from the World Health Organization, started that ball in motion.
And is that going to affect the availability or prevalence of glyphosate in the United States?
Well, hopefully educational, at least. People are also buying. This is Roundup. You can use it on your driveway. It's
Right.
also, Roundup ready corn and soy and cotton are engineered that you can spray that crop with Roundup, and the crop's supposed to live and the weeds are supposed to die. So, you might see an effect where consumers are like, oh, do I want to buy this? But if it's up to our EPA and USDA and FDA, they are going to continue pushing these chemical-laden GMOs until something else changes in our regulatory system.
Why? Why would the government be pushing these things that are just making money for Monsanto?
How long do you have? I mean, this has really become kind of the holy grail of what modern agriculture is that you have a problem, you solve that problem with a chemical. And Roundup Ready crops were the poster child of this. These were the first generation of GMOs. And now we're seeing weeds that no longer die when you spray them with Roundup. They're Roundup-resistant weeds.
Right.
So we're at a crossroads. You could do something else to deal with weeds. What we're getting from the biotechnology industry, from the chemical industry, which are the same companies, and their friends in the government is, let's go to the second generation of GMOs
2,4-Ds
that have 2,4-D and dicamba. We're speeding up the chemical treadmill.
Right. I understand that there have been charges that Monsanto used the public university system to spread misinformation about Roundup or its potential dangers, or at least doubt the way that the tobacco industry has done in the past and that the global warming deniers do. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So a group called U.S. Right to Know FOIA'd did Freedom of Information Act on a bunch of public university professors who are out there as really GMO cheerleaders, and they're everywhere. If you work on this issue, you've had to deal with them, and they're on social media, they're all over the place, and they go out there and they put on, and this was in some of the documents that came out, they put on their white hat as scientists to not just defend GMOs, but promote them. And so finally, the New York Times used some of those FOIAs to really expose that several of the highest profile folks in that world, one professor from Florida, one from Illinois, were getting money from Monsanto when they had publicly said that they weren't. They had publicly put themselves out there as independent experts, when in fact they had gotten money from Monsanto to defend their products and promote them.
When that happened in the tobacco industry, it was a national scandal. Why is America not shocked? I mean, this is in our food. We just have a couple seconds left.
It's a good question and needs to be shocking. It was on the front page of the New York Times. It was Labor Day weekend, so we hope that this starts to kind of pull that back and pull that veil back and make people ask questions.
Patty, great to see you.
All right, thanks.
Thanks so much. Bernie Sanders is leading Hillary Clinton in early primary states, and he's gaining on her in national polls. And major media outlets are starting to treat Sanders seriously, but not necessarily with complete honesty. Take, for example, Laura Meckler's article in the Wall Street Journal earlier this week. It was provocatively titled, "Price Tag of Bernie Sanders' Proposals, $18 trillion." The article starts off by dismissing Sanders' campaign as a long shot, and then goes on to call his proposals, quote, "the largest peacetime expansion of government in modern American history." In all, Meckler writes, he backs at least $18 trillion in new spending over a decade, a sum that alarms conservatives and gives even many Democrats pause. That estimate may give conservatives and corporate Democrats pause, but the whole article should give any reader who can do simple arithmetic pause. One red flag is that the clickbait headline makes it seem like the piece is talking about a one or maybe two-term estimate of what Bernie's budgets might look like, or even more extreme, that just getting his proposals off the ground would take $18 trillion. But the reality is that we're only looking at $1.8 trillion a year. That was a 10-year thing under Bernie's sweeping proposals. But that's just a little editorial sleight of hand to drive traffic to their site, right? Well, not quite. You see, the Wall Street Journal piece cited research by Gerald Friedman, a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And there was just one small problem with the Wall Street Journal's interpretation of this professor's research. They blatantly omitted his conclusion. But in the age of information, major newspapers are rightfully under more scrutiny than ever before. Professor Friedman saw the Wall Street Journal's piece and responded in the Huffington Post with an open letter to the Wall Street Journal on its Bernie Sanders hit piece. He writes that the Journal wasn't completely wrong. The program would involve spending $15 trillion on a single-payer health care program over a decade. But they left out the key detail. The Wall Street Journal left it out. But it would actually save, Bernie's program would actually save the United States a total of $5 trillion over those 10 years. We'd see those savings in reduced administrative waste, lower pharmaceutical and device prices, and by decreasing the rate of medical inflation. Because the simple fact is, we as a people are going to spend that $15 trillion on health care anyway. The difference is that under the current model, we pay that money to private insurance companies. And those private insurance companies have much higher levels of administrative costs, of fraud, and of general waste than Medicare does. Another difference is that the government would be negotiating drug prices, making drugs more affordable for everyone. And who would see that $5 trillion in savings? Well, businesses, for one, along with state and local governments, because they wouldn't have to pay for their employees' insurance, who'd be covered by Medicare for all. And individuals like you and me wouldn't have to worry about co-payments or deductibles, or worse, finding that the affordable plan that we chose doesn't cover a necessary procedure. You see, as Brew One points out over at the Daily Kos, the Wall Street Journal presented government spending in a fundamentally dishonest way, because what we spend can't be separated from what we'd save by going with different policies. Take Brew One's example of shopping for a car. He or she wrote, you don't buy a car by saying, well, it would cost me $10,000 here, but that same car would cost me $7,000 there, so the price tag on the $7,000 car is too expensive. Instead, you say, it would save me $3,000 to buy it from the other guy. And that's the point. It's not $15 trillion that Bernie's plan will cost the country, because we as a people will save that amount and more on health care costs anyway. Excuse me, we'll spend that amount on health care costs anyway. It's the $5 trillion that we, the people, would save with Bernie's plan, and that we would get back by adopting an efficient and affordable single-payer health care system for all. And that would be great for everyone and for the economy as a whole. Unfortunately, the Wall Street Journal's analysis of Bernie's proposals isn't just another routine example of shoddy corporate journalism. It's an example of how the corporate media tries to discredit and discard anyone who they can't control. And that's not just bad news for our political process. It's also bad news for the Fourth Estate, our news, which really should, at the very least, try to be honest in their critique of policy issues like this. And that's the way it is tonight, Thursday, September 17th, 2015. And don't forget, democracy begins with you. Get out there, get active, tag, you're it.